moving on to Murakami's more interesting and I think more valid kind of concerns and presentations, I think that his contrast between the strong regulation hypothesis and the weak guidance hypothesis is a valuable one. Again, I don't think he is original in this contrast. There have been other people who have done that before him, some of whom he actually doesn't give credit to. But the strong regulation hypothesis is at least a meaningful one, and so is the weak guidance hypothesis. Strong regulation hypothesis means the kind of regulation characterized by being mandatory, discretionary, and specific kinds of intervention by the administrators in the economy, which have characterized the Japanese economy. That is, if this hypothesis is true, then you will believe that there have been interventions of specific kinds in Japanese economy in the post-war period, that these interventions have been mandatory, that these interventions have been discretionary. The government or its administrative branches could change and fine-tune, and at times change drastically, the specific policies directed at specific industries. Murakami claims, and I think rightly, that this strong regulation hypothesis is not true in the Japanese case. The weak guidance hypothesis might be described as something that instead of being mandatory is indicative. You set targets, but they're general ones, and you don't set specific policies for industries as a whole, for the economy as a whole. You might have fixed rules rather than discretionary kind of steps. So whenever you have policies, the industries will know what those policies are and will expect those policies to be continued for quite some time in the future. And they will typically be industry specific. There will not be broad overall kind of. Did you have a question?
Yeah, how would you characterize MITI then, on the basis of these two alternatives?
That's a very, very good question. We will get into the idea of MITI being really one of the cornerstones of this weak guidance. But it's not a straightforward case, and therefore it is interesting. So let's discuss that when we come to that point. In fact, that's another weakness of Murakami's presentation, because he does not quite establish MITI as being a part of the weak guidance system.
No, because the general perception in almost all the literature is that MITI falls in the former category.
Yeah. Okay, I think it's worthwhile to have some discussion, at least during the discussion session. I will try to mention as much as I can during the course of this presentation. But I don't want to make Murakami's case for him. Now, Murakami calls, and this is where I agree with his terminology, indicative intervention by a better name. He calls it promotional intervention. Now, I tend to agree that this is better. Indicative is something that actually the French coined, and like many French terminology, it's more characterized by what it doesn't say than what it does say. And during this period when this term was developed, the French bureaucrats actually came up with a joke. Of all the bureaucrats in the world, I think the French are most capable of coming up with jokes. Well, their joke was that there were three types of planning. One type of planning was imperative, the other kind was indicative, and the third kind, which was the most common, and especially common in the third world, is the kind that is decorative. Now, Japanese plan is more indicative than decorative, but promotional intervention is more descriptive of what really went on in Japan. So these were really positive kind of incentives given by the government and its other organizations to the Japanese firm in the areas of financing, tax concessions, subsidies, research and development grants, And finally, last but not the least, government contracts. In Murakami's view, in order for promotional intervention to be effective, some conditions are necessary. Seems reasonable? And this is where he starts some of his theorems. One he calls theorem of long-term association. And it's also called Mura Theorem 1. I have been puzzled ever since I read this whether the Mura referred to the Mura type of organization or his own name. Well, according to this theorem, this promotional intervention is effective only if all parties concerned, intervenor as well as intervenee, this is when social science really becomes indigestible. Let's start over again. Indicative intervention is effective only if all parties concerned, intervenor as well as intervenee, are involved in close interrelations based on implicit, long-term, and multi-issued agreements. Now this is a good proposition. I don't think it's a bad one, except that it's a little vague, a little broad, a little uncertain, and certainly is no theorem. But let's look at it for whatever it's worth. What it says is that interventions are not automatically effective. They're also not automatically ineffective. If they are to be effective at all, then all the parties must be involved in close interrelations. So far, it's obvious and tautological, and it has been a waste of time for me to repeat this and for you to listen to me. But this is where it gets, I think, interesting and has more content. These close interrelations must be based on implicit, not explicit, but implicit, long-term, not short-term, and multi-issued, not single-issued kind of agreements. Here, there are the beginnings or the intuitions of what could possibly be a very, very interesting theory of organizational behavior. Instead of developing this, he has just presented this as a theorem, which is not just an abuse of the term theorem, as I mentioned before, but actually is frustrating the potential reader by tantalizing us with real prospects and then stopping the flow of thought at that point by stamping the word theorem on it. Because theorem in mathematics is something that actually is the culmination of a train of thought. You end with a theorem, you don't begin with a theorem in mathematics. And throughout this essay, there is this rather strange imitation of language of physical and biological sciences and mathematics, which I think is inappropriate and confusing and does not contribute at all to the quality of the essay. So what you might find in this essay, you will find in spite of the terminology. And what I have been trying to tell you, even though I have been very critical, and rightly so I think, is that there is actually some valuable kind of insight that one can get if one is patient enough to read through these things. There is also a corollary. First he calls it a corollary and then he calls it a theorem, which is also an abuse of mathematical terminology. He ends up calling this the theorem of fairness within an industry. His so-called Mura Theorem 2. This Mura Theorem 2 says that indicative intervention can be viable only if it is sufficiently impartial, or more concretely, if it is based on rules that can be viewed as fixed for some reasonable length of time. Let's look at this theorem again. It has to do with viability or workability of indicative intervention. It has to do with the rules that are to be used for indicative intervention. So rules have to be viewed as fixed for some reasonable length of time. What is a reasonable length of time? I don't know. He doesn't tell me. Uh, what is the difference between rules that are fixed and rules that are viewed as fixed? He doesn't tell us. What is the meaning of sufficiently impartial? When I'm being just a little bit impartial, when I'm being a little bit more impartial, and when I'm finally being sufficiently impartial, these are degrees that matter if this theorem is to have any meaning. So I would find most of this theorem to be just semantic confusion. The valuable part, however, is the following idea, which does not require the lofty title of theorem. The idea is very simple, that if you really want parties with different interests to agree on something and follow that they wouldn't have done on their own, if you want to be a mediator, then you have to be perceived as fair or impartial. Now there are many, many ways in which you can promote that awareness. And very few of them actually can be described in the way that these words are supposed to summarize those ways. A much more meaningful discussion about the relationship between the government and the Japanese firms can be found by examining specific aspects of those relationships, rather than trying to build an overarching theory and by giving various parts of this edifice very fearful titles like hypothesis, proposition, theorem, etc. don't really help. Where he gets better, I think, is when he gives specific examples, which really do not correlate at all with what he has said earlier. He has a very good description of the Japanese financial system and the guidance of the Japanese financial system by the Ministry of Finance and Bank of Japan. That's very valuable, and I think you should really read that from this source as well as from other sources. And I hope you have a concrete discussion of that after this lecture. A second area, which I myself will take up after I return, but you might benefit from some discussion among yourselves now, is that of industrial policy. Because there has been elements of industrial policy, especially by MITI, and this pertains to Ritu's question about the role of MITI. I think that if you examine the industrial policy, this is a very summary kind of answer, and later on I would like to spend more time when I return. The role of MITI really has varied from one period to another. There was a period when MITI actually was very far from providing with weak guidance. It actually was a very strong arm of the government which forced recalcitrant partners in the business to follow the way that was perceived to be in the national interest. By and large, during the late 50s and early 60s, I would claim, which I think is a defensible one, MITI played this role. In the late 60s and early 70s, it started giving more positive incentives to the firms for following its policies. In the 80s, with a great deal of international pressure, MITI actually has started promoting free market, or at least some sort of promotional guidance for reducing Japan's balance of trade surplus and promoting more buying from abroad. But this is done in a very relaxed manner. What MITI has done that was advertised in the West, I guess, a lot, was dramatically unfurl some banner from its building that let's buy more American or foreign goods now, which at one point would have been considered very unpatriotic, but now it's considered to be good sense. But beyond this and other kinds of rhetorical devices, MITI really hasn't pushed very far to implement this kind of policies. It has also relaxed in terms of guiding, especially the more successful industries in Japan, because those industries are considered to be mature and they also have more power, both market power and political power, now than they did in the immediate post-war period, or even in the 60s for that matter. I do hope that we have an opportunity to come back and discuss it when I return. The third element that needs to be discussed is the so-called market structure. There is a hypothesis of strong cartel which means basically that producers get together among themselves and fix prices and quantities. And Murakami, even though his rejection is not very reasoned at this point, I think rightly rejects this hypothesis in case of Japan. Cartels, if they are to exist, and if somebody is to claim that they exist, would require what I would call a positive identification rather than just inferential identification. The distinction between the two is the following. There's a very commonsensical saying, at least in some languages, that where there is smoke, there is fire, which is usually not true. Sometimes it is true. The smoke may come from fire, but it may come from many other sources. So if you just see smoke and you conclude that there is fire, logically that's a wrong inference to make. Logicians actually have a very forbidding name for this. They call this Modus Ponens. This is which has the following form. In formal logic, if you have a proposition which says if P then Q, right? If fire then smoke, which is true, right? And Q, which is there is smoke. If you have these two as your premises, if fire then smoke and Q, smoke, then you cannot conclude that therefore P. That's a wrong inference. It's a fallacious kind of logical inference to make. And some of Murakami's exercise actually even doesn't get that far. That would at least be drawing an inference, but he hasn't drawn an inference. He simply tells us that that's the wrong view. One would like to know why. I tend to agree that it is true. By direct observations, one can actually prove that in the Japanese case, these cartel-like practices are much overblown, especially by people outside of Japan. So one needs a direct examination of what Japanese business organization is really like, some of which we have covered, and some more will be covered in the future. There are groupings of large corporations, as we have discussed, but underneath these large corporations, there are an enormous group of subcontractors whose plight actually tends to be quite different in general from the plight of the large companies. Given these real differences, now Murakami introduces another very foreboding kind of title, very polysyllabic formulation, which sounds social scientific. He calls this competitive polyopoly. I thought I could pronounce Latin words, but this one stumped me once or twice too. So what is this competitive polyopoly? It says that each of the major industrial product markets consisted of a limited number of large corporations of comparable size. Any new entry was subject to MITI's control, and each firm's investment was at least loosely under MITI's guidance. He's careful enough to have stuck in the phrase "at least" here. So far, it's nothing but description. He's just describing what might have happened. Then he says, within this framework of entry restriction and investment coordination, however, the product markets were highly competitive in terms of price, quality, and so on, except during the intermittent recessions when MITI-guided recession cartels were introduced. Now, I want you to forget about the last part. I don't think it makes any sense whatsoever. Let's focus on what competitive really means here. What competitive means to an economist is really that there is no price competition. Price is given. So if you say that product markets were highly competitive in terms of price, if he's using the word correctly, then you'd have to assume that firms had no control over prices, which I think is patently false if one looks at the pricing policies of Japanese firms. And competitive about quality actually would then mean a different sense of competition. Murakami doesn't seem to be aware of the switch he is making. in going from one to the other. Because if you want to use competitive in the ordinary common sense, man or woman on the street kind of sense of the word, competitive, then surely firms compete in terms of quality. Economists sometimes also call this non-price competition. It usually happens when there is product differentiation with many sellers or when there are a few firms, technically oligopolistic market structures. So I hope at least I have clarified for you the various meanings that can be given to his proposition. I think it would be interesting if we could learn whether there are real rivalries in terms of price and quality and how these rivalries manifest themselves in the product market. That would be a really insightful exercise. But that is not done in this paper. At some point, I hope we can fill the gap by actually discussing some of these. But I need to move on because we haven't covered his polity yet. And in polity, there are some interesting discussion that at least was helpful to me because I don't know as much about Japanese politics as I would like. But again, conceptually, there is very little that is novel or original, even though there are a lot of subsections with headings that seem to be conceptual. But if one really summarizes everything that he discusses, one finds the concept of a late developed state that seems to be somewhat of a coherent concept. This late developed state seems to have two contending kind of characteristics. On the one side, there is a strong tendency to rely on a rather conservative but efficient bureaucracy. So it's a kind of Weberian look. Weber was a German sociologist who studied bureaucracy in a very interesting way. He showed the rationality of bureaucracy under the rationality of socio-economic political systems of capitalism. And Japan, which fulfills these characteristics, can be reasonably expected to rely on conservative but efficient bureaucracy. At the same time, and this is kind of interesting, I think, there is supposed to be progressivism in this state, ranging from classical liberalism to centralized socialism. Classical liberalism essentially is a free market philosophy, which has never been in evidence in Japan very much. So I'm rather surprised that that's one end of the spectrum. But maybe that end is defined more by its absence than its presence. And then centralized socialism, which is also baffling because I've never met a Japanese bureaucrat who would publicly defend centralized socialism. They feel quite comfortable with centralization. And some of them actually will defend privately socialism because many Japanese bureaucrats have had much more contacts with members of leftist political parties, and many of them have themselves actually read Marx, Engels, or Lenin, have read about the socialist experiments, etc. In general, the Japanese bureaucrats are much better informed. They are much less ideological. They are much more clear thinking and have a much broader background in terms of their readings in history, literature, politics, economics, and many of them tend to be graduates from Tokyo University, which trains its graduates rather well. They certainly are much better in that respect than their American counterparts, or even maybe their British or French counterparts in some respects, though I don't think that's a very clear-cut kind of comparison. French bureaucrats certainly are very, very efficient. So what do we get at the end of this? I think at the end of this, we get a description of the economy, which is only mildly accurate at best, a description of the polity, which is interesting at the empirical level, but is quite empty at the theoretical level, and an intersection that is never attempted. Well, given this, I think one should really think seriously about being dubious of every word of the title of this essay. that there is nothing particularly Japanese at the theoretical level about the discussion, though at the empirical level, there are lots of interesting facts and figures and historical descriptions of things Japanese, or at least events that happened in Japan, which might have happened somewhere else. It is not political economy, if you define political economy as something that is not merely the intersection, even that is not there, but political economy as something that is a particular way of thinking about the way politics and economics are integral to each other in society, which is the way they are, really. When you look at any economic action, there is usually a political component to it, and when you look at any political action, it has an economic component to it. But it's not the two components put together that makes political economy. The world, as it were, is already political economic. So that leaves us with some questions. First of all, going back to the earlier section on the economy, before we started talking about the Japanese model, I think it would be helpful if you discussed the following question. To what extent has the government policy contributed to growth in Japan? If it has, then which sectors have been helped the most and how? Later on, we might discuss the implications for these for foreign trade of Japan. Secondly, moving to what I just discussed, what kind of interaction? I feel slightly uneasy with the term interaction, but that's at least a start. What kind of interaction between politics and economics might best explain the Japanese success? I have suggested that it's not the kind that Murakami has described. Can you actually search for and find one that is better? That's the challenge with which I want to leave you. And by the time I come back, I hope you'll have thought about these things sufficiently so that we can discuss these things for the remainder of the course. Thank you very much for being so patient while I'm gone and listening to my shadow. And thank you for what I know is your great enthusiasm and hard work in my absence. I hope that you have enjoyed these lectures, that you have enjoyed this course so far, and that together, after I return, we can really make this a meaningful and rich experience for all of us. Thank you again.
সমবেত সুধীবৃন্দ, আপনাদের মাঝে সশরীরে উপস্থিত না থাকার জন্য আমি দুঃখিত, কিন্তু বর্তমানে ইলেকট্রনিক মিডিয়ার কল্যাণে অন্ততপক্ষে ছায়া শরীরে আপনাদের মাঝে উপস্থিত আছি, এজন্য আমি আনন্দিত। কবিতার মৃত্যু এবং উত্তর আধুনিকতা সম্পর্কে আমি কিঞ্চিত বলতে চাই। কবিতার মৃত্যু ব্যাপারটি ঠিক মন গড়া কিংবা কাল্পনিক একটি বিষয় নয়। জন অ্যাশবেরির সুনার মেন্ডেডের কয়েকটি পংক্তি থেকে আমি একটি উদ্ধৃতি দিচ্ছি। অ্যাশবেরি লিখেছেন, barely tolerated, living on the margin in our technological society, we were always having to be rescued. On the brink of destruction, like heroines in Orlando Furioso, before it was time to start all over again. কবি হিসেবে অ্যাশবেরির অবস্থান বিশেষভাবে লক্ষণীয়। নিউ ইয়র্ক স্কুল তথা আমেরিকার উত্তরাধুনিক কবিদের শীর্ষস্থানীয় এই কবি এখানে সরাসরি কবুল করেছেন যে প্রকৌশলের সমাজে কবির অবস্থান একেবারেই প্রান্তিক। একই সঙ্গে মডার্নিস্ট বীরত্বব্যঞ্জক এলিয়েনেশনের ভাবকেও তির্যক দৃষ্টিতে দেখেছেন উত্তরাধুনিক এই কবি। উত্তরাধুনিক পর্যায়ে এসে কবিতা কি সত্যি মরে যাবে, নাকি প্রান্তিক অবস্থানে বসে কবি ও কবিতা সরসে প্রান্তিকতার উপভোগ্যতার নজির হয়ে থাকবে পণ্যের এই সমাজে? উত্তর আধুনিকতার মধ্যে কি আছে শুধুই ধ্বংসের বীজ, নিহিলিজম, নাকি উত্তর আধুনিকতার যুগে যারা বর্ডার এবং মার্জিনের কাছাকাছি আছেন তারা সহর্ষে ব্যক্তি ও ব্যষ্টি হিসেবে সাহিত্যের হরির লুটের আসরে যোগ দিতে পারবেন? কবিতার মধ্যে নতুন আঙ্গিকের অঙ্গীকার কি এরই মধ্যে কিছু দেখা যাচ্ছে, যা ধসে যাওয়া, পচে যাওয়া জীর্ণ আধুনিকতার হাত থেকে নতুন যুগের কবিদের মুক্তি দিতে পারে? প্রবাসে সত্যিকার অর্থে পরবাসী হয়ে যারা বাংলার মতো একটি প্রান্তিক ভাষাতে সাহিত্য চর্চা অব্যাহত রাখতে চান তাদের পক্ষে প্রান্তিকতার মুখোমুখি হওয়াটাই আজ সবচাইতে বেশি জরুরি। এলিয়েনেশন বা বিচ্ছিন্নতাবোধ থেকে উদ্ধারের জন্য বিবিক্ত সত্তা অনেক কৌশলের আশ্রয় নেয়। মাতৃভাষার চর্চা অথবা চর্চার নামে আত্মমৈথুন তার একটি হয়ে দাঁড়াতে পারে। কিন্তু আমার মনে হয় যে সচেতন, বস্তুনিষ্ঠ, পরিশ্রমী লেখকের হাতে বিদেশে মাতৃভাষার চর্চা, বিশেষত কবিতার চর্চা উত্তর আধুনিকতার এই পর্যায়ে প্রান্তিকতার বিলাসের বাইরেও সার্থক সাহিত্য লীলায় পরিণত হবার সম্ভাবনা রাখে। কিন্তু প্রথমেই আধুনিকতা উত্তর আধুনিকতার সংজ্ঞা নিয়েই গণ্ডগোল। তাই উত্তর আধুনিকতা সম্পর্কে সামান্য ধারণা দেবার চেষ্টা করব, অস্পষ্টতা কিছুটা দূর হবে এই আশায়। জ্ঞানতাত্ত্বিক বা এপিস্টেমোলজিক্যাল পার্থক্য দিয়ে আধুনিকতা ও উত্তর আধুনিকতার ভিতরে একটি বড় মাপের সীমারেখা আঁকা গেলেও সাহিত্যে, বিশেষত কবিতার ক্ষেত্রে আঙ্গিকের প্রশ্ন অবধারিতভাবেই হাজির হয়। তাই সমসাময়িক কবিতা থেকে দু চারটি উদাহরণ পেশ করা অপ্রাসঙ্গিক হবে না বিবেচনা করি। অতঃপর আধুনিক বাংলা কবিতার ব্যর্থতা এবং তারই সাথে উত্তর আধুনিকতার যুগে প্রবাসে বাংলা কবিতার সম্ভাবনা নিয়ে সংক্ষেপে দু চার কথা বলেই আলোচনায় ইস্তফা দিতে চাই। পাশ্চাত্যে আধুনিকতা ব্যর্থ হয়েছে। দার্শনিক দৃষ্টিভঙ্গিতে দেখতে গেলে অ্যান্ড্রিউ রসকে অনুসরণ করে বলা যায় যে the failure of modernism is the result of a confusion between subjectivism and subjectivity. Modernism equates a philosophical attack on the epistemological and metaphysical tradition of subjectivism with a literary attempt to dispossess or to purge poetic discourse of subjectivity to quote. Consequently, modernism saw subjectivity as a problem which could be solved by reforming language itself. Just as thinkers have sought to eliminate the subjectivist bias of a post-Kantian philosophical point of view. ভাষা, বিশেষত কবিতার ভাষা, এই সব তাত্ত্বিক তালেবর গোষ্ঠীর আক্রমণকে নানাভাবে প্রতিহত করে। সচেতনভাবে আধুনিকতাবাদীর অপেক্ষাকৃত অচেতন বা অর্ধচেতন মুহূর্তে ভাষা জানান দিয়ে যায় তার মন্ময় রূপের বারতা। তাই পাশ্চাত্যের সচেতন আধুনিক কবিরা উপলব্ধি করতে বাধ্য হয়েছেন ইতিহাস ও বিজ্ঞানের ব্যর্থতা, সর্বোপরি ভাষা ও আঙ্গিকের ব্যর্থতা। টি.এস. এলিয়টের বিখ্যাত কবিতা দ্য ওয়েস্টল্যান্ডকে এখানে উদাহরণ হিসেবে সহজেই দেখানো যায়। অক্টাভিও পাজের পিয়েত্রা দে সল এই কবিতার সর্বগাত্রেও এই ব্যর্থতার চিহ্ন অধিকতর পরিস্ফুট। অক্টাভিও পাজ এ সম্পর্কে আরো বেশি সচেতন। এবং সেজন্য তিনি বোধহয় আধুনিকতা থেকে উত্তর আধুনিকতার পর্যায়ে উত্তরণ করেছেন অনেক সহজে। আমেরিকায় এমনকি ওলসনের স্বঘোষিত উত্তরাধুনিক ম্যাক্সিমাস পোয়েমসেও এই ব্যক্তি স্বরূপের দিকে ধাবমান কবিত্ব হয়ে পড়ে এক বিচূর্ণ সত্তা। I'll meet you anywhere, you say. I'll try once more to meet you. I begin to be damned to figure out where we can meet. It's no use. There is no place we can meet. ইহাব হাসানের মতানুসারে উত্তরাধুনিকতা এই বিতর্কটি আমেরিকা থেকে ইউরোপে সম্প্রসারিত হয়েছে। দ্য ডিসমেম্বারমেন্ট অফ অরফিউস বইটিতে এর আগেই হাসান প্রশ্ন তুলেছিলেন, আধুনিক যুগ কবে শেষ হয়েছিল? তার মতে সাহিত্যের ক্ষেত্রে 1920-এর দশকেই আধুনিকতা শেষ, অবশ্য পাশ্চাত্যে। এ সময়ে প্রকাশিত এডমান্ড উইলসনের অ্যাক্সেলস ক্যাসেলে আলোচিত হয়েছেন ইয়েটস, ভালেরি, এলিয়ট, প্রুস্ট, জয়েস ও স্টাইন। হাসান 20-এর দশক থেকে বেছে নেন পুরোপুরি উত্তর আধুনিক হিসেবে কাফকাকে। অবশ্য ফিনিগানস বইকে জয়েস আধুনিক না উত্তর আধুনিক বলা মুশকিল। তাই আধুনিকতার মৃত্যু ও উত্তর আধুনিকতার জন্মকালের সন্তারিকের তর্ক থেকে দূরে সরে গিয়ে হাসান শেষমেশ উত্তর আধুনিকতা এবং আধুনিকতার ভেতরে একটি গণ্ডি টানার চেষ্টা করেছেন কয়েকটি ডাইকোটমির সাহায্যে। এই বিভক্তিকরণ সীমিত হলেও এর হয়তো কিছুটা মূল্য থাকতে পারে, সেজন্য আমি এর কয়েকটি উল্লেখ করছি। মডার্নিজমের লক্ষ্য হিসাবে হাসান উল্লেখ করেছেন রোম্যান্টিসিজম, সিম্বলিজম, ফর্ম, পারপাস, ডিজাইন, হায়ারার্কি, মাস্টারি, লগোস, আর্ট অবজেক্ট, ফিনিশড ওয়ার্ক, ক্রিয়েশন, টোটালাইজেশন, সিনথেসিস, প্রেজেন্স, সেন্টারিং ইত্যাদি। পোস্টমডার্নিজমে তিনি উল্লেখ করেছেন এর বিপরীতে প্যাটাফিজিক্স, ডাডাইজম, অ্যান্টিফর্ম, প্লে, চান্স, anarchy, exhaustion, silence, process, performance, happening, participation, decreation, deconstruction, antithesis, absence, dispersal, intertext. আরো একটু এগিয়ে গিয়ে হাসান অব্যয়বিহীন বা প্যারাট্যাকটিক্যাল অথচ সংযুক্ত 5টি প্রস্তাবনাও দিয়েছেন, যা থেকে উত্তরাধুনিকতার রূপ সম্পর্কে আরেকটু নিশ্চিত হতে পারেন পাঠকেরা। Postmodernism depends on the violent transhumanization of the earth, wherein terror and totalitarianism, fractions and wholes, poverty and power summon each other. The end may be cataclysm and or the beginning of a genuine planetization, a new era for the one and the many. Postmodernism derives from the technological extension of consciousness, a kind of 20th century gnosis. The result is a paradoxical view of consciousness as information and history as happening. Postmodernism, at the same time, reveals itself in the dispersal of the human, that is, of language, in the immanence of discourse and mind. Postmodernism, as a mode of literary change, could be distinguished from the older avant-gardes, Cubism, Futurism, Dadaism, Surrealism, etc., as well as from modernism. Neither Olympian and detached like the latter, nor bohemian and fractious like the former, postmodernism suggests a different kind of accommodation between art and society. Postmodernism veers towards open, playful, optative, disjunctive, displaced, or indeterminate forms, a discourse of fragments, an ideology of fracture, a will to unmaking, an invocation of silences, veers towards all these, and yet implies their very opposites. They are antithetical realities. It is as if Waiting for Godot found an echo, if not an answer, in Superman. ফরাসি তাত্ত্বিক লিওতার পোস্টমডার্নিজম এর প্রধান বিশেষত্ব হিসাবে উল্লেখ করেছেন গ্র্যান্ড ন্যারেটিভ বা পরম আখ্যানের বিরুদ্ধে বিদ্রোহ, বিশেষত পাশ্চাত্যের অষ্টাদশ শতাব্দীর এনলাইটেনমেন্ট বা আলোকপ্রাপ্তিতার বিরুদ্ধে পরমাখ্যানের বিরুদ্ধেই এই বিদ্রোহ। মার্কস এবং হেগেলীয় প্রস্তাবনার বিরোধী হওয়া সত্ত্বেও লিওতার্ডদের বুর্জোয়া সমাজে জ্ঞানের প্রদক্ষিণ পথ সম্পর্কিত থিসিস মার্কসের পুঁজির প্রদক্ষিণ পথ বা সার্কিট অফ ক্যাপিটালের অনুসারী। উদাহরণস্বরূপ একটি উদ্ধৃতি দেওয়া যেতে পারে, জ্ঞানের প্রদক্ষিণ পথ যে মুদ্রার প্রদক্ষিণ পথের অনুসারী সেটা কল্পনা করা মোটেও কষ্টকর নয়। জ্ঞান এবং অজ্ঞানতার ভিতরে পার্থক্যের বদলে এখন আমরা দেখব মুদ্রার ক্ষেত্রে যেমন ঠিক তেমনি দাম দেবার জন্য জ্ঞান এবং বিনিয়োগের জন্য জ্ঞানের পার্থক্য। পুঁজির দাপট সম্পর্কে ফরাসি উত্তরাধুনিকতাবাদীরা সম্যকভাবেই ওয়াকিবহাল। ইংরেজিতে লিওটার্ড থেকে আরেকটি উদ্ধৃতি দিচ্ছি, When power is that of capital and not that of a party, the trans-avant-gardist or postmodern, in Jenk's sense, solution proves to be better adapted than the anti-modern solution. Eclecticism is the degree zero of contemporary general culture. One listens to reggae, watches a western, eats McDonald's food for lunch and local cuisine for dinner, wears Paris perfume in Tokyo and retro clothes in Hong Kong. Knowledge is a matter for TV games. It is easy to find a public for eclectic works. By becoming kitsch, art panders to the confusion which reigns in the tastes of the patrons. Artists, gallery owners, critics, and public wallow together in the anything goes. But the realism of the anything goes is in fact that of money. In the absence of aesthetic criteria, it remains possible and useful to assess the value of works of art according to the profits they yield. কিন্তু কবিতা তাহলে কি মুদ্রার কাছেই বিক্রি হয়ে যাবে? এবার তাহলে আমরা কবিতার প্রসঙ্গেই ফিরে যাই এবং এই প্রশ্নের উত্তর দেবার চেষ্টা করি। পূর্ববর্তী দার্শনিক বিতর্ক থেকে উত্তরাধুনিক কবিতার কিছু বৈশিষ্ট্য খুঁজে পাওয়া যায়। সমালোচক জেরোম মাৎসারো তার পোস্টমডার্ন আমেরিকান পোয়েট্রিতে ঠিক এরকমই বলেছেন, The essential difference between modernism and postmodernism becomes, in conceiving of language as a fall from unity, modernism seeks to restore the original state by proposing silence or the destruction of the language. Postmodernism accepts the division and uses language and self-definition. Rather than T.S. Eliot's belief that poetry is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality, postmodernists propose the opposite. স্বচ্ছ উজ্জ্বল বিশ্লেষণধর্মী হলেও উপরিউক্ত অনুচ্ছেদটি অসম্পূর্ণই বলতে হবে। আমার মনে হয় কবি সমালোচক জনাথন হোল্ডেন অনেকাংশেই সঠিক যখন তিনি দাবি করেন যে postmodern American poetic form, from the political invective of a baraka to the elegant assemblages of Ashbery, is not founded on